Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm sorry I've been away for so long, but I have been horribly busy with work. So that has kept me somewhat a bit full up, I'm afraid. So lacking the attention span of an attention deficit squirrel these days. But I thought I'd just do a video about a favourite topic. And now this is just going to be a short and simple video for today, but I am going to make it up to you by working on a longer video called How Germany is Destroying the Defence Aerospace Industry. So hopefully I'll get that done with the next few days, so do keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime, I thought I would do a quick conversation about our favourite Bond villain. And of course, that is Vladimir Putin. And the reason why I want to talk about him is because of the very interesting way in which he has been using the issue of grain shipments. So for anyone not quite keeping up to date with the news, what Russia is doing at the moment is blocking ships from going in and out of the port of Odessa in Ukraine to collect grain. And to remind everybody, those ships were being inspected in Turkey on the way in and on the way out to make sure that they weren't involved at all with weapons smuggling. That grain was very much destined for Africa, so for some of the poorest nations in the world, and the main customer for that grain was the UN food programme. So what Russia has done is not only pulled out of that deal to block ships from going in or out, they've also started bombing the grain facilities and the port facilities in Ukraine. Now there's absolutely no military defence for this action whatsoever. There's not even a strategic goal either in terms of trying to win the war in Ukraine. They're not going to starve the Ukrainians out, and yes, it may cause economic hardship for Ukraine, but that's not any different from the current situation that Ukraine is in. So the message I want to get across here is that this is a specific action being done by Putin as part of his negotiation strategy. He is not negotiating with Ukraine, and that's perhaps the thing that people need to wrap their head around. He is trying to negotiate with people outside of Ukraine. I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking that's a very odd way to try and negotiate your way out of a war that you're badly losing. But what you have to remember is that Putin acts like and thinks like a gangster. He can't show weakness. He can't allow people to think that he is in a weak position. So the only way he gets himself out of difficult positions is effectively to find leverage and to apply pain to other people. So let's take the example of when Prigozhin led the Wagner mutiny against Putin. It was discreetly reported that Putin very much was holding his family hostage. And that's a typical Putin action. That's a typical way in which he thinks, that he will try and find what matters to the people who are challenging him, and going after their families, their children. He has no limits. He doesn't mind doing that. So in a very sort of roundabout way, he is trying to do the same with the world. He wants this war to end, but he knows he cannot negotiate with Ukraine. Well, of course, they do want the war to end, but they certainly don't want the war to end on Putin's terms. So they're going to keep fighting him until his army is completely battered and basically has to leave Ukraine with its tail between its legs. That campaign for Russia is unsustainable. And they had hoped that the Ukrainian campaign was unsustainable. And that still remains Putin's and the Russians' hope. However, they're gradually realising that with the whole might of NATO and the Western world trying to support Ukraine, that, well, Ukraine may not be as unsustainable as they think. So Putin's going outside of Ukrainian borders And this is a typical negotiation thing. If you can't negotiate with the party directly, you try and find third parties to apply pressure. Now, Putin doesn't have many friends in the world. He might have China. He doesn't have India, really. But even China is not going to operate in a way that's detrimental to Chinese interests. So they have tentatively tried to float a laughable peace plan, and they do aspire to be power brokers in the global world. But again, this can't overcome the fundamental issue that Ukraine are not going to accept those terms. So China can't do anything unless they are able to make Putin compromise rather more significantly than he is willing to do. So instead, Putin has turned to the third world, the global south, particularly to Africa. And he is trying to use them as a power block to blackmail the West. He wants them to apply pressure on the Western world to weaken the Western resolve and to allow or to enable Putin's demand to be met so that those grain shipments can resume again. So this is the sort of Putin negotiation strategy, really. If you think about it in the terms of leverage, power, balance of power or lack thereof, and use of third parties, with a little hint of evil, actually quite a hint of evil, because that's the way Putin thinks. So that is the negotiation strategy. That is what he is doing. So the question now, it's a very interesting question, is what do people do about it? Now, recently we did see several, not all, but several African leaders go to Russia. And it's going to be interesting to see how they handled Putin. Do they acquiesce or appease to his demand? Do they confront him? Do they challenge him? Or do they try and find a middle way? And my very vague impression is that they tried to find the middle way. So I don't think they were fooled by Putin. I think they all know that the responsibility for their people starving lies with Putin, not really with anybody else. They didn't sort of join Putin and try and apply significant leverage on NATO. They did produce something that tentatively you might call some kind of peace proposal or peace document. But again, I've not read it myself, but from the reporting I gather it's one of those things that you can only imagine of having been produced with Putin's full approval. Whether he wrote the thing, I couldn't say. But certainly there was nothing in there that he would have found particularly uncomfortable, quite the opposite in fact. So a return to the 2014 borders, I believe that probably does include keeping Crimea. I think Putin has realized that he can't push for anything beyond that. That is just not going to be accepted by Ukraine and just won't go anywhere. So that is perhaps the point he is trying to put as his red line, his compromise point, the border of Crimea, and the stalemate situation that there was in the Donbass area. But rather interestingly, that peace proposal from the African leaders also include removal of the indictment from the International Criminal Court. And that was an interesting development. I can only really imagine that Putin particularly wanted that there. I would have thought the African leaders might have had other proposals and other priorities that they would have put in before that one. So again, this fuels the suspicion that this was very much a document created by Putin. And again, it perhaps shows, despite the outward facade of being a strong man and showing no weakness, actually he is very troubled by that development. So it's an interesting little insight, and I suppose it very much is a bit of an argument that proves people wrong when they say that those indictments don't matter. If they didn't matter, why did Putin put them in that document, or insist on or agree to having them in above other considerations? They must matter, and I suspect that is because they significantly limit him in his ability to go abroad, to project power, and so on. And this is the reality. Russia is massively losing influence right now. And they're probably losing influence even with people that would normally support them, particularly in the global south. Because they can see what Russia is doing. They can see the reporting of the war crimes. And they can certainly figure out that the grain and not coming out of Ukraine and the prices going up are all directly related to the actions of Russia. They can't blame NATO for it. NATO isn't blocking grain shipments. So now the concern, of course, is that people appease. And this is a difficult balance, and it's very easy to sit here in comfort and with plenty of food in my kitchen and say you should not appease a dictator. That cannot end well. For those in the global south, for those leaders who do have populations who are dependent upon that grain, this is not, it's easier said than done to tell them don't appease. They need that grain. They need to support their people. They are not individuals that lead countries with significant, financial or political power. So they have to operate as power blocks. And this is the thing. Do they challenge Putin as a power block? Do they appease him as a power block? And I suspect it would be a real struggle for them to get everybody to agree to a consensus of appeasement. Or do they just ignore him? There's an argument for saying just flag vessels in UN blue, sail them through to Odessa and challenge, the Russian Navy to harm them. That would cause quite a stink, quite a risk. I wouldn't want to be on those ships personally, I must say. But that is what could be done if the will is there. And this is one of the key things about negotiation. This is why I always come back to the critical word of consensus. You're going to have people who are going to struggle to stand up against Putin. It's easy for Europe, it's easy for America and their allies to stand up to Putin and say, get lost, you're not getting what you want, and you should restore the grain deal. But they do need to build consensus with other people who will suffer as a consequence of that action. They need to find a way of helping those countries, or at the very least mitigating the impact. Or they need to find a way to directly confront Putin in a way that he will struggle to deal with. So, and again, being very speculative here, if the UN was able to broker a scenario where all those African, let's say neutral or aligned ships, flagships, belonging to those African nations, for example, sailed straight up to Odessa and challenged the Russian Navy to harm them. That would be an interesting bluff, shall we say. And it'll be interesting to see what Putin does. He knows that the goodwill, or he is dependent upon their goodwill. So they do actually have perhaps more power than they're willing to say. But that power only exists if they're willing to act as a sort of unified group. And at this point, I don't know whether that's the case. So in addition to my message of the importance of building consensus, it's also the importance of collectivism. By acting as a group, even big, scary countries like Russia will be very uncomfortable challenging the group. And this links to a lot of previous things I've said in previous videos. Russia and China, to a certain degree, have suddenly discovered just how important it is to have friends in the global stage. Countries like America, massive as it is, economically and militarily powerful as America is, that is not the secret source that allows America to influence decision making. What allows America to influence decision making of so many different countries is the fact that they have relationships with those countries, the fact they can build consensus. They have friends, in other words. Russia doesn't, or at least not enough of them, and not powerful enough friends to make a difference. And so by attempting to hold the world ransom with grain, it has been a really interesting exposure of just how weak Putin really is and how ineffectual he is as a global statesman. He is perhaps not the global mastermind, the Bond villain bent on world domination that perhaps people thought he was. So perhaps a less of a Blowfield and more of a Dr. Evil for those who like their Austin Powers movies. So I hope you found this little video interesting. So apologies again for being away for so long, but do keep an eye out for the next video, which I hope will be a good one. I think it'll be an interesting topic, and we're going to go into something in really good depth and to really highlight certain negotiation theme. So in the meantime, thank you very much. Please do comment, please do like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.